Hello everyone and welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Vernon Creviston. In today's video, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off in the last couple of videos, where we're explaining kind of the different areas of English America. This is burgeoning English empire that begins in the 17th century. We've already looked at the Virginia colony, especially the Jamestown settlement, the first of those settlements in that colony, and we kind of looked at how it's grown and some of the issues that it had to deal with, labor issues and the reason for existence to begin with, getting past the high death rate that took place in that colony. And we saw that it was a bit of a struggle, but eventually that colony did survive. And being a thriving colony eventually, it's going to have a lot of influence, the Virginia colony. It really does influence a lot of the colonies around it, like Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina, especially in this idea that these colonies have at least some rudimentary ability to govern themselves, local day-to-day affairs. It doesn't mean that they're independent of England in any way, shape, or form, but just this idea that, they can pass local laws, deal with their own local issues. That was instituted in the Virginia colony in 1619 with the creation of the House of Burgesses. Wealthy landowning people had a say in how their colonies were run. Not a complete and total say by any stretch of the imagination, but at least they had some authority. And that led to issues, of course. Things like Bacon's Rebellion were because only a certain amount of people had really a political voice. Also, something else that was introduced the same year as the House of Burgesses in Virginia was the use of slave labor. Now, keep in mind, at first, for the first couple generations in the Virginia colony, really up until maybe the 1630s, 1640s, slavery wasn't as pronounced as the use of indentured servants. But as the use of slave labor grows, using enslaved people becomes more and more beneficial, economically speaking, for growing tobacco or other cash crop growth. More and more English colonists turned to that labor force. Things like the Bacon's Rebellion hasten the process that was already starting in the 1640s and 50s. So much so that by the 1690s, about 20 years after Bacon's Rebellion, it is now the way to own labor in the colonies, especially the southern colonies. And then we also saw the fact that if Virginia is kind of showing how to make cash crops valuable and how valuable the use of enslaved labor is, New England kind of shows how all these colonies are tied together. It's the New England colonies that start for entirely different reasons. They're not there as get-rich-quick schemes like Virginia or even Maryland might be. They're more of kind of a religious refuge for a group of disaffected Protestants from England. But pretty soon, that lifestyle, this rigid lifestyle of adhering to these religious dogmas, just can't work, especially as more and more non-Puritans show up in those colonies because they're thriving. The death rate's much lower. Land is still available. You get more and more people that own land that aren't Puritans that want a political voice. It tears these societies apart. As we kind of talked about last time, most of the other colonies besides the Massachusetts Bay Colony are started by people that get fed up with living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So Puritanism can't last forever. And by the 1690s with the Salem witch trials, we kind of see that this is a society that's just tearing itself apart. And more people just kind of leave that ultra-religious life behind and just kind of move into the mainstream of English religious thoughts and societies, right? They just become more English over time. But they're still connected. It is people in New England that are bringing enslaved people to Virginia and Maryland and other southern colonies. It is New England ships that are transporting tobacco back to England and bringing slaves over. So one thing we have to kind of see is there's a lot of connections here, right? These colonies, even though they might be far apart and maybe not always really connected well, they do exist in a bigger thing. And that's what today's lecture is kind of about, is we're going to start pulling back the lens a little bit and looking at these colonies in bigger and bigger units, if you will. And we want to start seeing how they fit into this bigger thing called the English, eventually the British Empire, the thing that they're going to rebel against eventually down the road. So what we're going to do today is kind of take a look a little bit in very general terms how these colonies existed, what their lives were like, some commonalities they had amongst each other, and we're also going to talk about one region that I really haven't mentioned much up to this point, and that's what's known as the middle colonies, right? This area that's in between the southern Chesapeake colonies, defined like Virginia, or the New England colonies, defined like through the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There are another group of English colonies that kind of curiously combine elements of those other colonies and kind of create something new and unique, right? So we'll take a look at that in this particular lecture today. Now, one of the things we do want to keep in mind here is that these colonies are small at first, and again, they grow really slowly. If you take a look at this map, the areas in green on the coastline are what are originally settled by the English by the 1650s. And what you see is a few remote pockets of English civilization. You've got the area in the Chesapeake, where Virginia is, and parts of Maryland. You've got these areas right here that have some English settlers, but it's actually claimed by the Dutch in the 1650s. Here's the New England region where they're starting to really spread out, and more Puritans are coming over all the time in this mass migration, right? But one thing we can say is there's a lot of space in between these colonies. There's almost nothing down here in the southern regions, right? But by the 1700s, as the English learn how to adapt to this area, as they push the natives out of the way and slowly but surely gain more land, they do grow. By the 1700s, you have English settlements all up and down what is going to become the eastern seaboard of the United States. They're pushing inland slowly but surely now, usually still along the rivers because it's easy for transportation and communication, but they're definitely spreading out. But one thing we can say is it's still slow, right? They're still not going very far. Natives are resisting. They're pushing back constantly. They're trying to say, no, this is ours. You can't have it. So there's conflict over and over and over again through these colonies. And of course, if you're the natives, as the English keep taking more and more of your land from you, you constantly turn to other Europeans like the French or maybe even the Spanish who aren't in your area, and you look to them for help, for resources, things like weapons and ammunition, that sort of stuff. So that helps explain why this is pretty slow. But the one thing we can say is these English colonies are growing, as slow as it might be. And what we can also say is we see three distinct regions, if you will. Up here in the north, that's where the New England colonies are. Those are the ones started by Puritans, but now by the 1700s are really just English. Then you have this area called the middle colonies because they are in the middle. They're made up of a hodgepodge of different people. Eventually, the Dutch colony is going to be taken over by the English. New English colonies are going to be started, and you're going to have people from New England and people from the southern colonies coming in and settling here and kind of creating a hybrid, if you will. And then, of course, we have the southern colonies. Started in the Chesapeake region with Maryland and Virginia, but then the Carolinas and eventually Georgia as well. So we have three kind of distinct regions, if you will, that we're looking at today. So let's start with those New England colonies. Again, we'll kind of do kind of a refresher from what we looked at last time, but also kind of look at what happens after Puritanism kind of disappears. And that's something to kind of keep in mind, right? We can tell that Puritanism, this idea of purifying England, making it a more Protestant country, has really lost its energy by the early 1700s because people are going to church less, right? They just don't care as much anymore. By 1740s, even though kind of the old Puritan churches are still there, most of the people that go to them, if they even go to them, aren't calling themselves Puritans. They're just Protestants. They just belong to this particular Protestant church or that particular Protestant church. And we can kind of know this because by 1740, there's only one minister for about every 700 colonists in New England. Now keep in mind, these are colonies that were started by ministers with their congregations originally. So it used to be closer to one minister for every 30 to 50 colonists. Now it's way different. The populations have grown a lot. There's just way more people here, and a lot of them aren't as interested in religion as they used to be. They still go to church occasionally, don't get me wrong. I mean, they may even go every week, but it's not the center of their lives anymore. It's not what they spend all their time doing anymore. It is no longer to show the world this is the right way to do things. It is now just, this is the way we live, this is my life, I work, I do things. That's what I'm all about. Now, a couple of things that we do want to remind ourselves, though. Because of those Puritan roots, however, the idea is that you have to be able to read your Bible, that you have to have this personal connection to God, means that things like education are very important in these New England colonies. It's there that you see the start of what will eventually be higher education in the United States. Things like Harvard and Yale are started in these Puritan colonies. At first to train more ministers, but eventually to train doctors and lawyers and teachers. They expand out into these other areas. So education becomes a part of this and has a profound impact on this region. You have a lot of smart people, educated people that are able to make a lot more money, have specialized services, and that's going to help this region thrive. Another thing that's going to help it thrive is trade. Again, as we mentioned last time, you're not going to make money growing food or growing cash crops on land in New England. It doesn't mean the land is horrible, it's just not that valuable. As I tried to point out, they're literally giving away land to the people that are settling there because it's not that valuable, right? Or they're selling it very cheaply when they acquire it. So where do you make money? Well, it's in trade. And New England becomes an important part of this thing that we call the triangular trade. There's a map of it down here in the lower right-hand corner. What ends up happening is New Englanders build ships, fund expeditions, trading expeditions, if you will, for ship owners to gather up supplies from the Western Hemisphere, whether it be furs, lumber, right? Most of Europe is cut down a lot of their forests. They need more and more lumber for wood to keep their homes warm, to building ships, building buildings, furniture, all that kind of stuff. It comes from places like Canada and the northeastern United States. They load up that lumber, that tobacco, those furs, that fish, whatever it might be, especially sugar cane from the Caribbean. They load it up on ships and they sail over to England, where they sell off all those raw materials, right? Unmanufactured goods, buy manufactured goods in England, sail down to the west coast of Africa, where they exchange those manufactured goods for enslaved people, and then they sail back across the Atlantic in what's known as the Middle Passage. There they sail to places like the Caribbean, or even places like South Carolina and Virginia and Maryland, and they sell those slaves off, take that money, buy more raw materials, and just do it all over again. That is the triangular trade. Very much so, New England is the heart of this trade. Again, about 1 out of 3 English ships or British ships is in a New England ship, built in New England, sailed by New Englanders, and they're the ones making the profit. So when you get down to it, New England becomes a pretty wealthy area. New England merchants are some of the richest people in the American colonies, these English colonies. Now, in the end, a lot of these big slave owners, these ones that own huge amounts of land and have hundreds of enslaved people, they're going to ultimately be the richest people in these colonies because they own a lot of land, they own a lot of people. That's a lot of value there. But when you get down to it, some of these New England merchants that are involved in this triangular trade actually have some of the most highest currency incomes, right? They actually have a lot of money on hand. People like George Washington are asset rich. They have lots of slaves, they have lots of land, that makes them wealthy. But a guy like John Hancock actually just has a lot of money, right? He's got ships, he's got supplies, he's got goods that he sells, and he just has cash. So these New Englanders are being pretty successful here, right? It's what draws a lot of non-Puritans there in the first place. There's more educated people, there's more urban centers, there's more places to ply trades, like being a doctor or a lawyer, so it makes sense. In a lot of ways, New England looks a lot like Old England. What's going on in the southern colonies, something a little different, right? Very rural, very agricultural based, and we'll talk more about that later on. But one thing we did notice is that even in these New England colonies, even from their first days when they were part of these Puritan holy experiments, right, these religious examples, uh, even then, these English ideas of representation, these English ideas that owning land gave you a political voice, were part of their system. So even though these Puritans were a little different, they still followed a lot of English attitudes and traditions. And most of these colonies, all of them as a matter of fact, had colonial assemblies. The people that lived there had at least some say in the way their governments were run. Not the English empire per se, that was the king's purview, that was Parliament's purview. But they could have a lot of control over their day-to-day affairs, right? If you were a landed white male, you had a chance to vote for people that ran your colony or maybe even hold office in your colony. Now, there wasn't just an assembly, though, running these colonies. There were often governors, sometimes appointed by the colony itself, sometimes appointed by the king or queen of England. It just depended on how that particular colony was constituted, who had ultimate authority there. Up until the early 1700s, the governor of Massachusetts Bay was appointed by the people of Massachusetts Bay, or the Assembly of Massachusetts Bay. But they did have them, right? And they were there. They were kind of a check on the power of the assembly. So we can already see one of the things that's going to become a defining feature of American politics is this idea of checks and balances, separation of powers. It's happening here in the colonial period as well. It's a very English tradition that we'll kind of see as we go forward here. And then, of course, one of the things that's very common in New England are these town meetings. That people will get together. Everybody in the community could actually come to these meetings, usually just males that owned at least some land, would get together and discuss some of the issues in the town and how to handle them, right? So there was local control, there was colonial control, and then there's imperial control, right? There are differing levels of government here, sort of like what we're used to today. And this is very much happening in this English empire of the 17th and 18th centuries. One of the things I do want to point out to you, though, is I've tried to hammer home here. Puritanism only lasts about 60, 70 years in these colonies, but it does have a lingering effect, if you will, right? Even if you're not a Puritan by the 1750s, you kind of still act a little Puritan. You still don't dress really flashily. John Hancock may wear some really nice clothes, has some nice jewelry on, that kind of stuff, but even he knows he can't flaunt it, right? And others living in New England are going to act very similarly. They're going to stay kind of in very kind of egalitarian styles, right? Again, here's an example of a house built in the 1750s. So Puritanism's been gone for 50, 60 years already in New England, in this place called Deerfield, Massachusetts, which is outside of Boston. So in this house, right, we can still see some of those Puritan effects, though. We know this is a rich merchant's house, first of all, because we have the records, but even if we didn't have the records, we would know this is a rich person's house because of all the windows, right? Glass is something that has to be imported from England. The fact that this person is using so much glass in their house says, hey, I've got money. But it's a way of saying I have money without showing off a lot of money, right? He's not using a lot of brick. He's not using a big ostentatious porch, right? He doesn't have a big veranda wrapping around the house or anything like that. So still here in New England in the 1750s and in the 1800s even, there's this idea that those Puritan ideas that you don't have to show off, that everybody knows who's saved, who's going to heaven, who's a good person, that you don't have to show it off. That's kind of been incorporated into their society. And these moral ideas of Puritanism are kind of lingering under the surface, even if the Puritans really aren't there anymore, right? But you kind of keep in mind how powerful that Puritanism can be in its long-term impact. And we'll kind of see that when we come back to things like reform movements in the 19th century and things like the abolition movement. There's a reason why it takes off in the Northeast, in places like the New England states, is because of those lingering impacts of Puritanism and these religious ideas that formed those colonies, right? Now, of course, as I mentioned before and in previous lectures, this trade is the important part of it. Being able to uh, make money somehow, right, is going to be incredibly important. It's what's going to lead Boston to being one of the largest cities in English North America from almost the very beginnings of its establishment. Established in 1630, by 1646, there's about 20,000 people living there. By early 1700s, there's 30,000 people living there. So Boston becomes the hub of this kind of commerce, if you will. It's where a lot of these ships are being built and sailed out of, and it becomes an important part of the English economy very quickly. Because it has to be, right? You're not going to make money growing food. You're just going to be able to support yourself, keep yourself alive. Where you're going to make money is in places like Boston, sailing ships. And of course, that helps build an urban environment, right? Bigger towns mean you need people like lawyers, you need doctors, you need craftsmen to make things for you, right? You might need a chair, you might need furniture. Sure, you might want to import some really nice stuff from England, but if you can't afford the really nice imported stuff, you need somebody that can make it for you, right? If you're a ship owner, you need somebody to make rope for you. Ropes are incredibly important on ships. You need somebody to make sails for you. So what you kind of see is it's not an industrial revolution taking place here, but you actually see the beginnings of what we would call a market economy in New England. And that's very important. That's going to be kind of a defining feature of it. Lots of small towns where there's commerce going on, people buying and selling goods for them. Sure, there's people farming, but they're not the richest people. Who are the richest people? The ones involved in all of this trade, right? And of course, one of the other things we mentioned last time, and I'll go through this kind of quickly because we covered this in the last lecture on New England, is that they attempted to work with Native Americans, but it was totally on the English settlers' side, right? They asked natives to come and live like them, but not with them. And in the end, natives got tired of having their land taken from them, just like they got tired of the Jamestown colonists constantly taking things from them, and it led to conflict. But in the end, those conflicts, things like the Pequot War and King Philip's War, went very badly for the natives. They fought well, they fought hard, they did a lot of damage to their enemies, but in the end, the English can replace losses much faster than natives can. The native populations are just becoming smaller all the time because of diseases and being pushed off their lands and conflicts with other native tribes. And the English just take advantage of that over and over again. As more and more people come from England to these colonies, their populations keep growing, the native population keeps shrinking. So in the end, this is kind of an inevitable push. It's slow, it takes time, but these English colonies keep getting bigger and bigger at the expense of the Native Americans. Now, the next group of colonies we want to look at are these things called the middle colonies. They're the ones in the middle that kind of end up taking some attributes of both the New England colonies and the southern colonies and kind of creating a new kind of hybrid culture, if you will. And of course, there's several important colonies there. The New York colony, what was originally the Dutch colony of the New Netherlands, is incredibly important. We'll talk about it. But there's really one that really defines the English nature of these colonies, and that, of course, is the colony of Pennsylvania, started by William Penn. So we're going to look at that one and just kind of see how these colonies differ from the ones around them. Now, the first thing I would like to ask you is just a simple question. What do you think? Do the middle colonies, were they mainly made up of settlers that left the New England colonies? Is that a true statement or a false statement? Well, the answer here is actually false. The middle colonies are made up of all kinds of people. Some of them are runaway indentured servants from the Virginia, Maryland colonies. Some of them are non-English people entirely, right? They're people in the Dutch colony. Remember, the Dutch opened their colony to people throughout Europe. They're just desperate for people to come and settle there to keep it safe, right? To defend their colony. So you have Dutch people living there, you have Jews from across Europe, you have some French Huguenots, French Protestants. You've got all kinds of different groups of people living here. And then you also have people like Anne Hutchinson, the woman that was banished from New England, from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because she wouldn't follow the rules. She wouldn't adhere to male authority. Well, she gets kicked out of New England colonies because she just doesn't like the way they're being run. She actually ends up in the Dutch colony in New Netherlands. That's where she finds true religious freedom, isn't in an English colony, but is in the Dutch colony, right? So you kind of see these middle colonies are going to be a curious mix of everything, if you will, right? Now, what is also kind of interesting is where the New England colonies are all Protestant all the way, just different types of Protestants, right? The middle colonies are mostly Protestant, but they're not all English Protestants. New York and Pennsylvania actually are very religiously tolerant. They have to be. New York, which is the renamed Dutch colony in New Netherlands, officially has what's called the Dutch Reformed Church, which is the Dutch Protestant church, a state church, one you pay taxes to support. But when the English take over, they say, okay, there's the Dutch Reformed Church as an official church, but so is the Church of England. The official Protestant Church of England is also an official church. You have to pay taxes to one or the other. But what if you're Jewish in New York? Well, they said that's fine. Go ahead and practice. You just pay your taxes to these Protestant churches, and then you can support your church however you want to. So New York can allow a lot of different religions, but it does tell you you have to support some. Pennsylvania is going to be religiously tolerant to the point where it says do whatever you want as long as it's Christian, right? So there are some limits there. Places like New Jersey and Pennsylvania will not have official churches, which means you don't have to pay taxes. You pay individually to your church if you want to support it. That's entirely up to you. So you can kind of see religion's very curious here in the middle colonies. It's very individual. No particular colony has a monopoly on religion, if you will. Now, one thing that's also a little different here is we see that farming has become more important in these colonies. As a matter of fact, the colony of New York and Pennsylvania are huge agricultural giants in the region. They grow lots of food. Their soil's really good. They're a little bit further south than the New England colonies. Their growing seasons are a little bit better. Their soil is a lot richer, so you can grow a lot more. Now, it's too far north to grow things like tobacco, good cash crops, but you can actually grow a lot of wheat, a lot of corn, a lot of other types of foodstuffs that are very much in demand, especially in places like the Caribbean where they're growing sugar cane and they can't take time to go and grow food for their enslaved labor populations. So they buy, sugar growers in the Caribbean buy a lot of food from the middle colonies. Who's going to transport all that food for you? That's where those New England merchants come in their ships. They transport stuff. One of the biggest things you'll notice, though, are that growers along the Hudson River in the New York colony grow a lot of food and ship it throughout the colonies. Growers in Pennsylvania grow a lot of wheat and ship it throughout the colonies. These colonies kind of become the breadbasket. They grow a lot of the food for all the other colonies. So these are going to be important colonies. They're going to be part of this big triangular trade that I mentioned, and they're going to have their own place to do things. So here in these colonies, you can actually be a farmer, not grow tobacco or rice or indigo, and still make a pretty good living. But you're also part of this trade network. So you're going to have merchants there as well. So again, this blend of things, right? You can have somebody that's a merchant in one part of these middle colonies and growers in the other area. They can also use slave labor, right? There are farms in New York, there are farms in Pennsylvania where they actually use slave labor to grow their wheat or grow their apples or whatever crop they're growing. So slavery, like in the southern colonies, is going to be a very useful a method for exploiting people and making more money, and they'll do that in the middle colonies. The northern colonies, the New England colonies, they're more involved in the transportation of slave labor and making money off of selling people rather than actually utilizing the slave labor, although there is some use of slave labor in the New England colonies. So again, kind of this curious blend of things going on. One thing that is a constant, however, is all of these colonies, just like New England and just like Virginia, have their own colonial assemblies. Again, people that own land think they have a voice in their local day-to-day affairs, and they do that. So here in the middle colonies, it's a much more open now, right? As long as you are a male and own land, you pretty much can either hold office or at least have a vote. The amount of land you have to own to vote to hold office is much lower here in the middle colonies because there's a lot of land, it's easy, and it encourages more people to come. The Dutch did it this way. Many of the other colonies in the middle colonies, including New York when it gets taken over by the English, will kind of continue that tradition. They'll also have governors, often appointed by the King or Queen of England, to kind of check the power of these assemblies. But for the most part, these assemblies will run the basic day-to-day affairs. And like in New England, they can often have town meetings that run their very local affairs, where even more people are participating and having a voice in their government. Now, a couple things I just want to remind you of that we talked about in earlier lectures. Remember that one of these middle colonies, especially the one called New York, is actually not started by the English, but by the Dutch. They came here to get part of the fur trade under control. They established towns like Brooklyn, New Amsterdam, and Fort Orange, which will eventually be renamed. Fort Orange will be called Albany. New Amsterdam will become New York. Brooklyn, well, it'll still be Brooklyn, but spelled differently. And these Dutch origins slowly get taken over and reinvented as the English. That actually happens in 1664. So this Dutch colony lasts about 40 years, and then the Dutch are taken over. There's a war between England and the Dutch Empire, and the English win it pretty convincingly. They don't take all the Dutch Empire by any stretch of the imagination, but the English do see this Dutch Empire as just kind of in the way. To kind of go back to this map, kind of keep in mind that up here in this map, over on this side, you have the English. Down below, you have the English. So if you're the English, you don't like having the Dutch right here in the middle of things. It's a threat to you. And if you're the Dutch, you're worried that the English are going to try and take you out. And indeed, that's what happens in 1664. And when the English take over, they do change what's happening in this colony to some degree. They take away a lot of the property rights that were given to women under Dutch law. It's one of the reasons why Anne Hutchinson went to this colony, is because she was on her own. Her husband stayed behind in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was a way for her to have a legal entity, right? For her to actually be in control of herself, was to go to the Dutch colony. They'd allow that there. But when the English take over, they revamp Dutch law into English law and say, look, women have to, their rights are through their husbands or through some male member of their family, right? There's a patriarchy here, and you have to, women have to go through those men to actually have their legal rights protected. If they don't, then they can lose everything. Another thing that the English undo from the Dutch colony is this idea that African Americans, enslaved or free, could have some control over themselves economically. Those are done away with. Even free African Americans in the old Dutch colony, now the English colony of New York, are prohibited from doing certain jobs. Those are reserved only for white English people or white settlers. But even though there is kind of this rollback of freedom, if you will, that the Dutch gave a lot of settlers, it's still a very diverse colony. It still has a lot of different people speaking a lot of different languages. The origins of modern New York, that's this cosmopolitan place, actually comes from that Dutch period, and it continues through the English period as well. So again, you can kind of see these middle colonies are going to have a lot of different people in them, and because they're different groups of people, they have to find ways to coexist. They have to find ways to kind of not be authoritarian like in the New England colonies, where you could kind of say it's our way or no way, right? Or get out. You can't really do that in this colony because people are just too different. Now, of course, we want to turn our attention to really the colony that defines this region. Of course, that is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has an interesting origin. It actually starts as a payoff to a debt to William Penn's father, John Penn. The King of England, Charles II, the son of Charles I, when he comes to the throne in 1660, he owes a lot of people a lot of money. One of those people is William Penn's father, John. John is a rich merchant. William Penn is not a noble by any stretch of the imagination, but his family is pretty well off. They're in this burgeoning trade empire that England's putting together. And William Penn's father has amassed a pretty good fortune, has become an important person in London, and has loaned a lot of money to the king. This is going to be a very common story in our class, that English kings often need money. They don't have a lot of wealth per se themselves. They own a lot of land, they have a lot of power, but they don't actually have a lot of money. Other English nobles have much more money because they're involved in this trade empire that's taking place. So what English kings often do is they borrow money from their people, right? Especially important people like William Penn's father. Well, King Charles actually ended up owing William Penn's father so much that he said, look, I can't pay you back. I just don't have the money. So to make up for that debt, Charles II, King of England, promises to give William Penn's father a huge amount of land. As a matter of fact, the document that's written up to pay off this debt is so imprecisely worded that William Penn may, when his father dies, have inherited essentially North America. Now, of course, North America wasn't Charles II's to give, but he's basically saying you can have as much land as you want, whatever you think will pay off our debt, because it's all you're getting out of me. So when William Penn's father dies, William Penn inherits all this land, all this money, this trade empire. And he decides he has to figure out what to do with it. And that ends up being a kind of an important point for him because you see, like a lot of other people in 17th century England, he's worried about rights and being able to practice his religion the way he wants to. You see, he is a form of a Puritan. Again, Puritanism isn't gone, it's just changing here in the late 17th century. And he is a member of what we today call the Quakers, right? They're called the Society of Friends, that's their official name. But they are a form of Puritans. But they're a different type of Puritan, right? They have they're much less aggressive about it. And William Penn has noticed that the current King of England and his brother, who's going to be the next King of England, aren't particularly excited about Puritans because they still want to get rid of the Church of England. They still want to get rid of these really stupid practices, in their opinion, of communion and indulgences. But they also understand that the getting rid of those things makes the king angry. So William Penn would like to create a place where his people can go, live freely, practice their form of Protestantism the way they want to, without any oversight or rubbing anybody the wrong way. Quakers are very much about kind of peaceful coexistence. That is kind of at the core of their brand of Protestantism. So he decides, what better thing to do with all this land I've inherited in the New World than to create a colony, one established to allow people to freely practice their religion however it may play out. Right now, when he says practice their religion, he means some form of Christianity. But eventually he's going to open up his colony to even non-Christians, right? He's going to say, hey, look, as long as you believe in God, I'm okay with that. You just can't run the place. You have to be Christian to run the place. So when he creates this colony, he's actually intending it for more than just Quakers, right? More than just his form of Puritan. He's really going to open up the place for others because he thinks that's actually the answer. He thinks those Puritans like John Winthrop from the 1630s got it wrong. They're so rigid, so controlling that they just can't be successful. And indeed, he's right. Those colonies kind of collapsed under the weight of their religion and had to kind of reinvent themselves, right? Penn wants to avoid that. So he decides to establish his colony of Pennsylvania, Penn's Land, and start this kind of holy experiment. Allow people to kind of have religious freedom and establish their own way of doing things. Now, of course, it's his land, so he's going to be in charge. He's going to establish the rules, but he's going to give people a whole lot of latitude. And one of the interesting things he does more than anybody else is he actually sends representatives over to talk with the natives before he even allows anybody to start settling there. He actually purchases the land from the natives. Now, whether it's a fair price or not, that is a very subjective thing. Most of the natives are going to say, and rightfully so, that there are very questionable acts here at the core of this purchase. But he does actually try to work out a deal with the natives, which is more than a lot of these other English are doing. So you got to give him some credit for at least trying to do things the right way, even if he actually doesn't do them the right way and kind of still cheats natives out of some of their land. At least there's an attempt here. Not sure if that makes it better, but at least there is an attempt. So we can see that the William Penn is going to be a little different, right? Now, one of the things we do want to understand is the fact that this Quaker lifestyle is very different than what we saw in other brands of Puritanism. First and foremost, they're pacifists, which means they don't believe in using violence of any type in any way. So that's kind of why they need to be on friendly terms with the natives. They need to make sure the natives know they're coming and that they're going to live in a certain area so that they don't have conflict with the natives. Because if there's a Pequot War or a King Philip's War here, it's going to go badly for these Englishmen. They're going to get wiped out pretty easily. Now, another thing that you'll notice from the picture here at the top of the screen is, again, these guys, these Quakers, like other Puritans, kind of dress a little more simply, a little plainer, right, than other people. They're not trying to show off their wealth. Now, it doesn't mean they don't wear nice clothes. They absolutely do. But they don't have to wear a lot of fancy clothes. They don't have to wear a lot of jewelry to kind of let people know they're successful. Again, it's this idea of kind of fitting in, what we would kind of say egalitarianism, this idea that we're all kind of equal, because that's actually at the core of this Quaker philosophy. Is this idea that we're all human beings, we're all the same. Whether you be a native, an enslaved person, or a white English person, you're all God's children, you're all part of the same humanity, and that we're all the same. Now, what is interesting, however, is that doesn't mean you can't own people. Quakers will own natives as slaves. Quakers will own Africans as slaves and use them as enslaved labor. So Quakers aren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but more than a lot of other groups of people, they do see the humanity in others, and they sometimes question their own practices. Some Quakers are saying, should we really be involved in the slave trade if we really believe these things? Some of them say, well, it's good money. We want to make money, don't we? We want to prove that we're good at what we do, just like anybody else. And others are going to say, but doesn't that come at a high moral cost? So they'll talk things out. As you kind of see in the upper left-hand corner here, they have discussions, lively discussions in their churches, in their social meetings, in their assemblies, talking about these big things, just like the Puritans did when they were deciding whether to establish their colonies or not. Another thing you'll notice that kind of it makes these brands of Puritans, these Quakers, different is you'll see in that upper picture on the left, women are a part of these meetings, right? Well, both religious and non-religious, and they can speak their minds as well. Now, there's still some segregation, right? Women are in one part of the congregation, men are in another. But for the most part, women do have a chance to speak out, right? They do have a chance to kind of let their words be known, their feelings be known. Now, again, men are still in charge. Men are the ones that hold the voting rights, but women do have a way to express themselves in this society. So not nearly as repressive as what we saw in the Puritan colonies in New England, much different. Voting rights are very wide. If you're a Christian, you own land, regardless of the size of those land holdings, you can participate in politics, even hold offices. There are very few taxes. There are no military service, right? Again, they're pacifists. They don't believe in violence, so you don't have to have a standing army or even what we would today kind of call a National Guard style defense. They're about trying to live and let live. So a very different world, if you will. And also, one of the reasons why they have to be a little bit more opening and accepting, where they won't say, hey, you have to be a member of our Quaker church to hold office, is because William Penn wants this colony to be open to other groups of people. When he creates the colony, he starts not only a kind of a public relations campaign in England to advertise his colony, to tell people, hey, come here and I'll give you free land. He actually opens it up across Europe. He tells French Protestants, who are a small minority in France, hey, if you don't feel safe here, if you feel oppressed, come to my colony, you can live there. He tells Jewish people, come to my colony, it's okay. And pretty soon, because of the free land he's offering, because of the religious toleration and political opportunities his colony offers, it becomes a thriving colony. By 1700, it is one of the largest colonies physically in size, but also in population. Only Massachusetts and Virginia are bigger than Philadelphia by the early 1700s. And this city of Philadelphia, so Pennsylvania is the largest, third largest colony. The city of Philadelphia, when it's 20 years old in 1700, is second only to Boston in population. By 1750, Philadelphia is the largest city in English or British North America. It is growing that fast. So if you ever wondered why all those important meetings like the First Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention took place in Philadelphia, it's in part because it's in the middle, but more importantly because it's the largest city. There are just more hotels, there's more commerce, it's a port city, it's easy to get to, right? That's why Philadelphia becomes such a big deal. It's why it's one of the first capitals of the United States when we gain our independence, because it's established, it's big, it has a lot going on. And that starts from almost the very beginning. So you kind of see just how fast these colonies grow, just how the more tolerant you are, the more that can lead to kind of advance this growth, to really accelerate it, if you will. So you can kind of see what's happening here. The English America, it takes a while to get going, but once it does, once it starts establishing itself, it really does take off quite rapidly, especially in the 18th century. It's slow in the 17th century, the 1650s, the 1670s. There's a lot of growth. There's a lot of issues to deal with. But by the early 1700s, they've dealt with most of those issues, and the English are growing fast by this point. A lot of people are coming from England, and then just these colonies are growing. They're having lots of families, lots of kids, and growing organically as well. So lots happening here, right? And again, to kind of point out something here, William Penn creates a thing called the Charter of Privileges, the rights you as a settler in his colony have. And he gives them a lot of things, right? So what thing doesn't he give people? Well, one of these things is not included, but the rest are. So let's kind of go through this. Does he allow anyone owning land and a Christian could be a member of the assembly? As a matter of fact, yes, he does. Think about that, right? As long as you live in this colony and you're a Christian, right? Don't even have to be a member of his particular brand of Puritan church, the Quakers. You can be a member of the assembly. So he really does open this up to a lot of different people. He establishes that there's going to be an assembly and a governor. The governor is going to represent his personal interests. He's the owner of this colony, the proprietor as they're called, right? But this assembly is going to have some powers to run things. This governor is going to make sure that this assembly doesn't go too far. Again, checks and balances. That's a part of this charter. He guarantees freedom of religion. He says, hey, look, even if you're not a Christian, you can live here and practice your religion. You just can't run the place because this place is supposed to be for Christians. So again, he's not pushing people into his Quaker church. He would like them to join it, but it's their choice. If they want to belong to some other form of religion, that's their choice. Go for it. You can live here. You just can't run the place. The one thing that he doesn't include is that this assembly, as a representation of the people, would have sole control over the colony. Again, there's this idea of checks and balances. You don't make one thing completely in charge. That's corrupting, and it can take too much power and do bad things. So we can kind of see here in the early 1700s, a lot of things that we kind of take for granted today, things like religious tolerance, things like opening up and being a little bit more democratic across the board to different groups of people that live there, are very much built into English America, British America. And also this idea that you don't want one part of the government to have all the power, that it becomes too dangerous, is obviously already built into this English America. Now, to kind of show just how all of this is working together, right, and show kind of how these colonies are starting to fit together, let me tell you the story of this guy. You may have heard of him. His name is Ben Franklin. Now, Ben Franklin is actually born in Boston, in Massachusetts, in 1706. And as he grows up in Boston, he decides that that place is still too socially restrictive for him. Even though it's not Puritan anymore, it is still religiously repressive to him, right? He's not particularly excited about religion, and religion is still an important part, if not the important part of society in New England. So at a very young age, he decides to leave home, and he actually becomes an apprentice, an indentured servant for one of his own older brothers who's living in Philadelphia. His older brother moved to this new colony to try and take advantage of the growth that he saw happening there. When Ben Franklin gets to Philadelphia, he decides this is the place for me. It's way more open, it's way less repressive socially, you can kind of do whatever you want, and that's going to work out well for this guy. He personally, he's going to be married a couple of times, but he's not as interested in keeping his marriage vows as many. He's going to have a lot of affairs, he's going to have a lot of illegitimate children, and he just didn't see that being possible in kind of repressive, kind of conservative, socially conservative New England. So he finds his kind of way here in Philadelphia society. After working for his older brother for a few years, he starts his own printing business. That's what he learned how to be, was a printer, making newspapers. Then he starts his own business and becomes a competitor and puts his own brother out of business, right? He starts becoming a leading figure in this town, starts giving himself his own education. As a matter of fact, he ends up buying so many books that he decides to create a company out of it. One of the first libraries in the English colonies, or the British colonies, is started by Ben Franklin, where he charges people a rental fee to come in and see his books, to use his books. As a matter of fact, it is still there to this day, almost 300 years later, right? It still exists, the Library Company of Philadelphia. So this guy, Ben Franklin, is a perfect example of what's happening here, right? He starts in one of these other colonies, decides that that's not the place for him, moves to one of these other colonies and thrives. Here in Philadelphia, that is a largely agrarian colony, he's finding a way to make money based on trade and commerce, right? By making newspapers, supplying people with information, and then selling them information in other ways through his library company. Becomes a scientist, right? He self-educates himself as a scientist, writes all kinds of pamphlets, and does inventions like the bifocal glasses, specialized stoves for heating places, experiments in electricity. He becomes an Enlightenment figure. So he really does kind of encapsulate just what's possible in these colonies. A guy that starts out as an indentured servant as a teenager, by the 1730s and 40s is one of the leading figures of the colony of Pennsylvania. Everybody throughout the colonies is hearing about who this guy is, right? His writings are all over the place. People are talking about his inventions and his scientific experiments. Heck, he even catches the attention of the government back home in England and starts becoming a representative for these colonies. So in a very big way, Ben Franklin shows what's possible in these colonies, how far you can go, how much opportunity exists here. And it's a very positive feeling that's happening in these colonies. Definitely not for everybody, but there is this idea that, hey, if you try hard enough, you work hard enough, you can get somewhere. And we can kind of see the beginnings of the American dream from John Smith through Ben Franklin alive and well here, even before the United States exists. Another thing I want to kind of point out to you is how we're starting to see some changes here in these middle colonies, right? Compare this against the house I showed you back in New England, where they were still kind of building kind of simply, weren't showing off their wealth. Well, you kind of have a curious mix of that here as well. Here, this house is much larger than the one in New England. So again, they're trying to tell you, hey, I'm doing pretty well here. I'm a pretty rich person. But they're still building in local materials. They're using local rocks, river rocks, right? But to build a house out of rocks like that takes a lot of specialized skill. So even, and the fact that they have a lot of windows tells us the person that builds this estate, this manor house, is actually pretty wealthy. They're not showing it off. They still don't have these big giant verandas. They still don't have these big opulent mansions, but it is a lot bigger and it's made with expensive materials. So again, showing off without showing off too much. We can kind of see that being able to display wealth in the middle colonies is kind of important, much more important than it is in the New England colonies. Again, New England colonies, you all live in the same towns. They're small. You can travel around really easily. You know who the important people are. They don't need to show it off. Here, because these colonies are bigger, there's maybe less communication between these communities. You want people to know you're important. That you're somebody to pay attention to. All right, let's kind of wrap up here with a look at these southern colonies. Again, we spent a lot of time on Virginia, so we understand a lot about what's happening there, but we want to kind of remember a few things, right? Now, the one thing I would like to ask you, just kind of a way to break all this up, is to ask you, in the southern colonies, do they emphasize religion as much as other colonies, like in the New England or middle colonies? And what we should remember is no. Right? None of these colonies start as really religious refuges, although Maryland technically does as a refuge for Catholics from England. It's actually settled almost completely by Protestants, runaway indentured servants from Virginia. So even Maryland doesn't have much of a religious underpinnings as it would seem. Although because there are Catholics there, they have to have some religious toleration. One of the first religious toleration laws is created in Maryland in 1649, the Act of Tolerance as it's known by that assembly. So there is religion in these southern colonies, but it is not the focus point as it is in the other colonies. It is very much, the focus here is economics, right? Getting ahead, making wealth. That's really what it's about. Another thing that we're going to kind of notice about these southern colonies is different than what we're talking about in the middle or in the New England colonies, is that there are few really large population centers. Again, kind of keep in mind what I just said about Philadelphia. Within 20 years of Philadelphia's creation, it's the second largest city in English British North America. But that never really happens in the South. Jamestown actually gets kind of abandoned after the 1670s, after Bacon's Rebellion destroys most of the town. Williamsburg now becomes the capital of Virginia, and then eventually Richmond. Virginia kind of becomes forgotten, and they have to go find it again, right, to rediscover where it was. That's what you visit today is a rediscovered Jamestown. It actually disappears for about 100 years. But what we do kind of notice here in these southern colonies, like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, is they don't have a lot of major population centers. Even Charleston, right, what was originally called Charlestown, now named Charleston, it wasn't that big of a town. It was just where you went to ship your goods out of, or to import goods that you needed, or to buy slaves, those sort of things. It was a very rural area, not a lot of big settlements, a lot of small villages here and there where the poor farmers might live and where the big farmers might congregate to hold meetings or to go to taverns or go to church. But for the most part, this is a rural area dominated by farmlands and farm activity. That is really what the South is all about. And we can kind of see it in some factoids, right? Remember, I told you in 1740, there's one minister or religious person, leader, in New England for about every 700 people or so, right? So fewer and fewer people going to church, or if they do go, they don't go that regularly anymore. We can kind of see religions on the downswing in New England. But here in the southern colonies, it's even less important, right? There's one minister for about every 5,000 people. So what that means is, instead of a minister living in one town and everybody coming to him, here in the southern colonies, ministers go out and around and go to many different places. So that one day they might be in this village or little town, and then the next week they're over in this village or the little town, and they perform their services like marriages or hold Sunday sermons, whatever it might be, and then they move on to the next place. So religion is not a focal point for you. You don't show up at a church every week just because you have to, right? You show up every once in a while because you need to or you want to. A very different emphasis on religion in these southern colonies. And also, because of their rural nature, it means it's a lot harder to get education. There's going to be a lot fewer teachers. It's going to be harder to build buildings for these schools. It's why education takes a lot longer to come to the South, right, to southern colonies. Take, for example, the College of William and Mary, one of the first colleges in the South. It's founded in 1693 near where Charlottesville, Virginia is today. Started by wealthy planters, these big tobacco growers, as a place where they can send their kids to get a good education. That is almost 100 years after the colony of Virginia is started. Compare that to what's going on in New England. 1636, they start Harvard in Boston, and they started their colony in 1630. So it doesn't take them long to say, hey, we need education, we want education, we're going to pay for education. Much different in the southern colonies. Their focus is on getting land, getting labor, growing cash crops, making money, buy more land, buy more labor, and just keep repeating the process. Eventually, as they get very successful, as their wealth accumulates, then they can turn their attention to other things like education. Because after all, after building a big agricultural empire, you want to make sure your kids are able to take it over and run it as well as you did. They're going to need an education for that. It's another way of showing your wealth as well. I can afford to send my kids to college, you can't. So we see something interesting happening here from the very beginning, right? Because religion is less important, because the focus is on economics in these colonies, we see kind of a stratification starting to appear. Education is available for the wealthy, but not for everybody else, right? It's only for those that can afford it. That is very different than what's happening in New England or even in the middle colonies. There, they're going to say, hey, people need to be able to read their Bible. People need to be able to be educated to make good decisions because they own land and get to vote. Not going to happen so much here. Because Bacon's Rebellion fails, a lot of landowners may get to vote for members of the assembly, but they actually aren't going to be able to hold office because they don't own enough land. Only the biggest landowners, like a Thomas Jefferson or a George Washington that own thousands of acres, can actually hold office. So again, we see kind of a stratification happening here. Another thing that we see is the reliance on cash crops. The idea that you need to grow tobacco, rice, or indigo as a way to make money. You're not going to just grow food to feed yourself or feed other people. You want to grow a commodity that people want to pay for. That's how you're going to get rich. And of course, that means you need a lot of land and you need a lot of labor. At first, they use indentured servants, but pretty quickly they start using slave labor, enslaved people, to make that, because that's even more profitable. If you can own a person their entire life, not just for a few years, that makes you a lot of money. If you can write some laws that say you can own their children as well, now that's even more profitable, makes you even more money over the long haul. So as the price of value of tobacco keeps going down, because they turn to slave labor, generational slave labor, it makes that tobacco valuable still. You can still make a lot of money. And those rice growers in South Carolina are actually some of the richest agriculturalists in English America. They have a lot of land, a lot of slaves, and make a lot of money. So this system is working for some of them. Definitely not all of them, but some of them are making a lot of money. Now, one thing that is kind of common throughout all these colonies is the fact that these colonial assemblies exist, that you as a white landowner have at least some say in this colony. Maybe you can only vote for the person that's running for office, but you get to have that say, right? Now, if you own land, you get to vote. If you own land, a lot of land, and are educated, you get to hold office in these southern colonies. So a little bit different than what's happening in New England, definitely, and even a little bit different from what's happening in the middle colonies. And we definitely, even in politics, we see this stratification taking place. The largest landowners with the best educations get to be the ones running things. Other people that own land just get to vote for which of those people get to run things. But here we also see the fact that governors are a part of the equation. Again, you don't want all the power in one part of the government. You want those checks and balances. So a lot of similarities between these colonies, but also they play out a little differently, as I've tried to explain along the way. And I think here you can really see how these southern colonies are starting to become different than the rest of those colonies. This mansion is in Virginia. It's the Stratford Lee Mansion. It's outside of what's today Charlottesville, kind of near where Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and others lived in Fairfax County. And here we kind of see the difference. While in those other colonies, those other houses I've shown you in this lecture, you want people to know you're rich. Here, you absolutely feel you are rich, and you want to show it because you want people to know just how rich you are. So these guys that own a lot of land, that run their colony, or members of the assembly, they are important members of their community. Their communities revolve around them, and they want to point that out. So when you travel to their lands, you walk across thousands of acres of lands. It might take hours to walk across this guy's land and get to this big house. And when you get there, as you walk up to it, you're reminded in no uncertain terms that this person is rich and deserves respect, that you need to pay attention to them. Because you may not have ever met them before. These farms are so huge, so far apart from each other, you may have just heard about this person and never actually met them. Very different than what's happening in New England, where you kind of see each other on a daily basis because you're living in the same communities. Not happening here in the South. Here you want to tell people how rich you are. You want to show that wealth off so that you can get the respect you're due. So even if they don't know you, they know you're somebody to be paid attention to because you're dressed really nice, you have lots of great jewelry on, you live in a big fancy house. And also, if you're one of the poorer people in this area, this is the person you go to. There's no banks nearby. There's no help nearby. The person you go to is the big wealthy landowner in your community. You need a loan, you're going to get it from him. You need to sell extra crops, this is the guy that buys them. So this person you have to keep happy or else you're in trouble. He's not going to buy your spare crops, get you that extra cash. He's not going to loan you money so that you can buy more land, so that you can get wealthier, right? These people have a tremendous amount of power and influence, and they're not afraid to use it. So something very different happening here than what we see in the New England or even in the middle colonies. Another way to look at this is just kind of at their pastimes, the way they spend their time, right? Here we have, and this is from the from the early 1800s, so a little bit outside of the colonial period, but it's something that happened almost from the very beginning. Once the Virginia colonies established, and then Maryland and others, right, they did these sort of things. Horse racing. Remember, you may not have a minister in your town, so how do you blow off some steam, have some fun on a Sunday when there's no church to go to? Well, have a horse race. It's a way for you, a southern planter, these big agriculturalists, it's a way for you to show how wealthy you are. I can afford a horse that just races. That's all it does. I can afford to keep that animal. You can't, you're not rich enough. So it's a way for you to show if you're a good rider. It's a way for you to show you can raise good horses. And it's a way to entertain yourself on a Sunday afternoon. So it becomes part of Southern lifestyle, so much so that we still do it to this day. Things like the Kentucky Derby are based on these old practices. And look at what they've done here as they come here to enjoy themselves and watch this horse race and kind of test their abilities. They've done something. Over here on the left side of the picture, you see a bunch of people that seem to be really well-to-do. They're dressed really nicely, they're close to the action, but they're not going to get dirty when the horses run by. They're not going to get any mud on them. Can you think of another sporting event that's kind of like that? Kind of describing like an NFL game, aren't I? Or any really sporting venue. You have the sky boxes, you have the box seats, the really nice views of the action where you're not going to actually be confronted by anything, right? You get a great view and no danger. Now, what else has happened here is this group of people is what we would kind of call the middle class. Right now, there aren't technically socioeconomic classes at this time. Historians call this the middle sorts. They're the people that can get want a good, nice look. They're invested in this race. Maybe they're betting on these races, but they can't afford to sit up here. They don't have that kind of power and wealth and clout. So they kind of get close to the action, but they're going to get dirty or they're not going to always get a great view. And then, of course, there are these people up here, crowded together, the worst view, farthest away from the action, maybe not even able to see anything because there's people in the way. So what they've done here is they've separated themselves out, not necessarily on race, although that's part of it, but really on socioeconomic levels. The rich are over here in their boxes, the middle sorts are here close to the action, and then you have the poor up here. Very much like what we would see at a NFL game or a Major League Baseball game, right? The price of the tickets sorts people out. People in the very top, farthest away from the action, those are the poor, right? The people that can barely afford to go to these events. People that have good seats, but maybe not right on top of the action, that's the middle class. And then the people that have either the nicest, cushiest seats or the closest seats at the best vantage points, that's the rich. So you kind of see something is different here in these southern colonies. It is very much about economic status. It is very much about getting beyond religion. Now, I'm not trying to say that religion is non-existent here, and I'm not trying to say religion is the overpowering or overriding force in the middle or the New England colonies. It's not. But definitely there's difference of opinion here, right? Another way to kind of see this is in another pastime that you would find in southern colonies. It's called gander pulling. And again, you could find this in a lot of places, but it's very much associated with the old American South, especially the colonial period of the 18th century. This is a sport or a pastime that poorer people would do. Well, ones that can't really afford a horse race because they can't afford a horse that just races. They need a horse that can work and do a lot of things. So a way for you to show off your riding skills is by doing this game, okay? So you can read it, but I'll just describe it really quickly. The whole point is you take a live male goose called a gander, and you put all kinds of grease on it to make it slick. And while it's alive, you let its wings free so that it can flop around a lot, but you hang it by its feet so it can't go away, it can't fly away. And the whole point here is when you hang it from a tree limb or from a crossbar or whatever, then you're going to have people ride by on their horses at full speed, and they're going to try and grab that goose's neck, and pull. And whoever pulls the neck off, pulls the head off, kills that bird, wins the bird and gets to cook and eat it. Now that's pretty horrific. If we were to do something like that today, we would be arrested, and rightfully so. But again, this kind of is a testament to how these southern colonies have developed. Remember what we talked about earlier. There's a bunch of young guys coming here, seeking their fortunes one way or another. They create a society that has a lot of violence in it. How do you keep control of indentured servants? Well, through violence. How do you keep control of enslaved people? Through violence. Violence becomes a part of the society. So sports like this become acceptable in southern colonies that wouldn't be accepted maybe in the middle colonies, and definitely wouldn't be accepted in the New England colonies, right? The power of religion, the power of the way their societies develop would not allow this to happen. They would just be seen as barbaric, as just demeaning, as just kind of a way that just awful people behave, right? So because there's not enough women in this society to kind of dictate what's appropriate activities, that sort of thing, this becomes kind of a pastime that gets ingrained into Southern culture. So we kind of see a lot happening here in the South that's different than the other two regions. And that's going to be incredibly important going forward. The South is a part of all of this. They're English just like everybody else. They do a lot of the same things everybody else does, but then they do a few things that are different, or they kind of take a different tack or a different direction with the same thing everybody else is doing. And it means that they're not entirely the same, these southern colonies. They have developed in a different way, and it's going to make it possible down the road as new differences emerge for them to see themselves as different and eventually to call themselves something different when we get to the Civil War. So again, in the origins of these colonies, you can see some of the issues that we're going to have as a nation down the road. And you can see how things like slavery actually are starting to impact society in unintended ways. It's becoming a part of the economy in all the colonies, but it's also affecting the way people deal with their world. Violence is just becoming a more accepted part of American society, even when it's part of the English or British empires. Violence is just a part of it, right? So lots to think about and lots to kind of keep going on with here, right? Now, a couple things I want to end with, a couple more questions for you. Something to think about based on these lectures. Could we say by the 1700s that English colonists living in North America were united in political, religious, and economic interests? Is that a true statement or a false statement? Well, you should be able to say that that's false, right? They're not all following the same types of politics. They're not all following the same religions. They're not all following the same economic interests. They are tied together loosely, but they're not all doing exactly the same thing. The next question is, by the 1700s, would those colonists living in those colonies call themselves Americans? And that answer is also false. They're not going to call themselves Americans. They're going to call themselves Englishmen or British colonists. They see themselves through their home country still, right? We haven't gotten to the point where they can call themselves Americans. At most, they would say, I'm an Englishman or a British colonist living in Virginia or Massachusetts. That's how they would kind of define themselves at this point. So we're still nowhere near the point where these colonies are ready to become a country, right? What they are very diverse colonies living in very different ways with very different populations. And with that being said, they are still English, right? They still do things the same way. They can still see each other as Englishmen or British subjects. Okay, so there's a lot of nuance here that you have to kind of unpack, and hopefully by reading your textbooks you'll pick up a lot on that. But it's something for you to kind of keep in mind. There is no such thing as America yet. There's just the English Empire, eventually the British Empire, and these colonies and how they fit into them. And that's what we're going to look at over the next couple of lectures. All right? All right, well, thank you very much for your time. I think we got through this one a little faster than some of the others, but please keep up with it and keep watching these. You'll get a lot out of them, all right? And so until next time, I'll see you.